Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
I'm Tim Houlihan. Behavioral Grooves is on a mission to share conversations with researchers, practitioners, authors, and accidental behavioral scientists to help us understand why we do what we do.
And we'd like to think that you're going to hear those conversations on Behavioral Grooves in ways that you won't hear them anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only do Kurt and I feel like we're in a masterclass every time we hit the record button with one of our guests, but we also love sharing these conversations with you.
Yes, we do. When we started Behavioral Grooves in the fall of 2017, we had no idea that we'd have listeners in more than 120 countries, or we would be record and publish more than 160 episodes.
Isn't that the truth? It's really rewarding to see that we've been able to share great, insightful conversation with lots of people, and it just makes me happy to think about it.
I'm glad we're going to share this episode with listeners too, but before we do, we just want to remind you that podcast search engines offer suggestion based on the number and quality of reviews that a podcast has. So by leaving us a good review, you'll be helping other people learn about Behavioral Grooves.
So thank you for leaving us a review today. Okay, so in this episode, we spoke with Elspeth Kirkman, a longtime researcher and leader in the infamous Behavioural Insights team in London. Her passion for behavioral science is matched really only by her dedication to public policy and to the future of education.
For the sake of context, listeners should know that we rescheduled with Elspeth 4 or 5 times, each time because of some last-minute interruption for one of us. And on the day when we finally thought we had everything worked out, it was one of those damn computers and internet technologies that conspired against us. We had an hour blocked out for our call with her, but ended up only having 30 minutes of recording time. It was really challenging, and we are so grateful that she was such a good sport all along the way.
And that is the point of the story. Like once we got past the scheduling and technical challenges to record the session with Elspeth, she was generous and thoughtful and offered some terrific wisdom that rings through in our conversation. And we are so excited to share it with you today.
Elspeth shared thoughts about her favorite decision models, the advice she might give her 16-year-old self, and some ideas on what the future of behavioral science might look like as we dive deeper into research and do a better job of mainstreaming the field.
So it's a short but terrific conversation, and we hope you enjoy it. If you like our podcast, please leave us a review on the listening app of your choice. We'd love to hear from you and what you think about Behavioral Grooves.
So sit back and enjoy a great cocktail of 16-year-old self-thinking and listen to our conversation with Elspeth.
Elspeth Kirkman, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we're going to get started with a quick speed round. I want to find out whether you're a coffee drinker or a tea drinker.
Decaf coffee.
Decaf coffee, good.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Would you rather have dinner with your favorite musician, actor, or sports figure?
Musician. The sports figure would not eat the things I would like to eat.
I like that answer.
Okay. Would you rather be expert in a new language, or would you rather master a new instrument?
Language.
Okay.
All right. Which might be more effective at attracting bike share riders, using the term free or $12 off? What? Even if the $12 off meant it was free, which is going to attract more?
I'm gonna say free, but that's also gonna put me to the test as to whether that's truly the answer.
And we brought this up because you wrote a piece on this.
Oh, no.
Let's tell free riding or discounted riding. Let's hear a little bit about that background. Bring that up.
Yeah. So this is a project that I did with the city of Portland when I was working in the US. And they wanted more people to ride their rather excellent bike share. And we looked at whether behavioural science could help them on that. They've got pretty great data, which is always a big treat. And they were sending out this is a really nice story, actually. We've done a bunch of work with the city and loads of people that I worked with there who are so fantastic, really enthusiastic about behavioural insights. And we'd run a couple of different trials. And one of them rang me up about maybe 3-4 months after we'd finished working there and said, we're about to send out this offer to people to use our bike share initiative. And we were thinking we could test 2 different variations. Are we supposed to randomize who gets which one? And I was like, ka-ching, yes, you are. What an amazing question to receive. Because normally you get, we just randomly sent everyone in the north version A and everyone in the south version B. And you think, okay, that's not random, but let's see what we can do with it. So we co-designed these 2 different variants of the message. One was a free ride frame, so basically telling you what you got for free. And the second one was a frame that was $12 off. So the offer was identical in terms of numerical, in terms of economic value. It was $12 off, $12 off each time. But we wanted to test which one was better. And I think the thing that I actually found most interesting about this, when I was listening to your episode with Katie Milkman, and it was inspired a lot by her work, was the difference between the reaction from people who had newly moved into a neighbourhood with the bike share scheme and people who had a new bike dock built near them. So they hadn't moved. They didn't have a fresh start, as we might term it. But they did have fresh infrastructure because basically it was considerably more effective. I think from memory it was about 3 or 4 times more effective for people who's just moved and have that kind of fresh start. And we did find that there was no overall difference in redemption of the offer between whether it was $12 off or whether it was free. But people did prefer the free offer if they happened to live in a neighbourhood with a new bike dock in it. So one of our subgroups did prefer the free thing.
What's fascinating for me is I would have made the assumption that free would have been more effective across the board. Because of just the literature around. I mean, Dan Ariely talks about the difference between, free and 1 penny, right? And this idea of free just has a different connotation in most of our brains. And so, any insight, any hypotheses on your part as to why it just obviously it worked better for those existing neighborhoods where it was brought in, but with people moving in, it didn't seem to have any significant difference. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we went back and forth on this. Our initial hypothesis was, of course, exactly that. The free thing is just going to be so much more attractive. We're going to see these big effects, and this was a 7,000 household study, so it's not a sort of small sample problem or anything like that. We had a bunch of different hypotheses. One was that the main kind of barrier might be absolutely nothing to do with how attractive the offer is. So it could be that there's just so many barriers to entry for riding a bike that it really doesn't kind of come into play. And I think that's somewhat backed up by the absolute numbers behind this study. So, I'm saying things like it was 4 times more effective if you happen to have just moved to the neighbourhood. It's still really quite low take-up. And one of the things that we found with this, which is obviously a kind of killer question in public policy, is sure it was significant, but in terms of investment, it didn't kind of really quite wash its own face. And it's not, it's a useful, if you're going to do promotions anyway, it's a useful thing to know about who to target and potentially how to frame it, but it's not like the killer takeaway from this isn't this is what you should be doing to get people to ride bikes. And when we did a little bit more kind of, just, I won't call it qualitative research because it would be overstating it, but chatting to people about perceived barriers and all of those sorts of things, there's everything from kind of how confident people feel riding to how busy the roads are around there to, what they associate biking with to the business of their day to day and all those sorts of things. So it could just be that it's not really kind of touching the point to sort of do the framing piece. And then equally, for the group, I think the reason, so directionally, free did look better, but it gets so kind of dominated by this much bigger response from these new movers that it sort of gets washed out, because for those folks, there was no real difference in terms of their appetite for take-up. And that might be, anything from a fresh start effect, as we're hypothesizing, through to they're really not very cash rich because they've just moved house. Although hilariously, one of the reviewer comments that I got on the paper was that most people have had financial assistance to move house, and I kind of thought that's really funny because most people aren't assistant professors who get paid to move city. Yeah. So I'd like to turn over to
you've been with we've been doing work with the BIT, the Behavioral Insights team, for more than 7 years, right? And
Yeah.
are there any favorite models? Do you think that there's some magic model that you guys have worked on, developed? I mean, we're all fans of East, that's for sure. But what comes to mind as really having some gravity in terms of applicability in the world?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different models that we like to use in BIT. I think most of the magic and the sort of secret sauce of some of our best projects is more about people with diverse skill sets, perspectives, academic backgrounds, experience working together and working together really deeply with practitioners. So the vibe is always, we'll come with all of the sort of wonky behavioural science stuff, and you'll tell us how it actually works on the ground, and then together we'll kind of figure out what's likely to fly, and that combination tends to work best. And actually, one of the things I always say is that we have all of these sort of fancy ways of diagnosing problems and coming up with solutions and all these frameworks, and often what you end up finding is your best intervention is the thing that is essentially emulating the very best practitioner in that team's practice. So whatever the best person in the team tends to do is their sort of hunch of what's going to likely work best for whoever they're working with. That tends to be the thing that sort of wins out. So some of the very simple things that we first started out with, like, why wouldn't I just send people a text message the day before their debt is due so that they don't get debt collectors coming round? You don't need a behavioural scientist to come up with that insight. You need somebody who's spent 7 years dealing with people who have debt collectors coming round and figuring out that they don't open their mail and all of those sorts of things. That said, we do have models that we use. I'm a really big fan of UCL's COM-B model as a way to diagnose problems. I just find it very clarifying as a way to both sort of in my own mind separate out what the barriers to changing a behaviour might be, but it also just tends to resonate really well with people who aren't experts in behavioural science, and it also helps kind of focus and park some of those big structural questions about, why can't we address capitalism, for example? You can sort of say, well, that's in a different bucket.
So you're writing a book with Michael Hallsworth right now, right? Or written a book, right? So tell us a little bit about that. What Michael's one of our favorite people. So
yeah, well, even after having written a book with him, he's also one of my favorite people. So it's a testament to what a wonderful co-author he is. And we wrote it on either side of the Atlantic, on different time zones with very little time to sort of chat in person about it. So I think will remain for a very long time one of the biggest feats of collegiate working that I've probably ever experienced. But it was really enjoyable. The book is called Behavioural Insights. Aptly, it's an MIT Press Essential Knowledge Series book. So that basically means that it's a sort of relatively short primer on the topic. It sits as part of a series. It was really enjoyable to write, not least because we got to reflect on a sort of decade of this stuff being mainstreamed into public policy, and obviously the sort of roots go much deeper than a decade, but we got to kind of look back at things. It was also quite confronting to write because, the commission was, you two are experts in this, you do it all day, every day. Can you just write it into a book? And we went, yeah, of course we can. I mean, we're experts in it. We do it every day. And then we sat down to write it. And, the first sentence, you're going, Behavioural Insights is, no, wait, are? You think, I don't even know, I don't even know if this is singular or plural, let alone what it is /are. So it was a very fun way of us working out what we do and don't know, and quite humbling, but ultimately very rewarding.
Well, in the process, do you think that there was something that emerged as something that you felt like is being not paid attention to enough in government policy? Are there some aspects of behavioral science that you think could really be beneficial if they were implemented or applied more? Yeah,
I mean, the last chapter sort of looks at what do we think is coming next, or what do we think a successful version of the future for behavioural insights would look like. And one of the sort of less exciting but most critical answers that we have on that is that we should just make behavioural insights almost invisible. It should be so entrenched and deeply embedded into everything that policymakers do, that it kind of doesn't have its own name and its own thing. It's just part of the, diagnostic and design process for delivering policy. And I think that is starting to happen in things like government communications teams, for instance. I think there's been a real mainstreaming of some of the insights and some of the measurement methods, evaluation methods. I still don't think it happens when policy is designed, and that's partly because of how policy is designed. So, policymakers are decision makers and human beings in their own right, with all their own quirks and everything that comes with it. And so often, things are being done at pace, they're being done with strange incentives, all of this sort of stuff. So you get classic behavioural errors in the making of policy. But I also just think we haven't stretched our imaginations enough yet about the limits of application. And we're still very much stuck on, well, if it's not a very small change to how you're framing information, then it's kind of out of scope. And actually, we know that some of the most effective behavioural interventions and pieces of behavioural public policy are well beyond that, and the default design of programs and those kinds of things.
Right. You mentioned that writing that part of this process, it was humbling. What was humbling? Was it just understanding the breadth and scope of everything? Was it trying to capitalize that or conceptualize that into something to put on pages that is, understandable? What's the humble part here?
I mean, I don't know about you two, but I feel like my life is just a series of looking at myself 5 years ago and feeling deeply embarrassed about how little I knew and how much I thought I knew at the time. And, that is only going to continue, I'm sure. And I felt like this was just an accelerated version of that, where instead of 5 years, it was, the 4 months we wrote it in, where we went from the sort of, we can definitely, I won't speak for Michael, but I went from, of course I can write about this, it's just saying what I do all day, every day, to thinking, God, I know nothing, and then coming out at the end with something that I felt happy with. So it was, humbling as a sort of reminder of the limits of your knowledge and not the limits of knowledge in its entirety, and had to butt up against my own limits a lot and do loads of research. But ultimately, that was actually a really quite enjoyable process. And so I think when I say humbling, I don't mean that as a bad thing in any way. I just mean it was a good reminder of how much there is still to kind of learn and be inspired by, and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I look back last week and I'm embarrassed about what I thought and did last week. So it doesn't take 5 years for me.
What keeps you engaged? You love, obviously your passion for the work is tremendous. What keeps you engaged?
I think having lockdown has been very revealing on this, because I am never very good at knowing what kinds of things excite me or engage me until they're gone, and then you notice it. So like we can segue into music with a nice Joni Mitchell reference there. But I think in-person interactions with people, particularly people that work in the area that you're trying to design an intervention for, is what makes me most excited. Actually, my dream week would be half the week really kind of like down and dirty on the front line, getting paper cuts, looking through the filing systems people have to use, and talking to people and figuring out what the kind of real problems and how they manifest are. And then the other half of the week, just sitting in silence in a room with data. That would be the perfect week.
Yeah. Just actually being able to do both sides of that.
Yeah.
You brought up Joni Mitchell. I just have to ask, do you like to, have your musical taste changed since you had a baby 7 months ago?
My algorithmic recommendations about my musical tastes have changed dramatically. So I got a notification from Spotify recommending stuff based on my heavy rotation list, which was white noise and nursery rhymes. So clearly Spotify hasn't figured out that this is not a new genre that I've embraced, and rather that I've had a baby. And now I'm just trying to get her into apart from mindless nursery rhymes, I like to rock her to sleep to the Smashing Pumpkins. And she seems to really like it. So I get to kind of indulge my musical tastes with putting her to sleep.
I love going to sleep to the Smashing Pumpkins. There you go. I could do that. Tim, on the other hand, would not. But I use music to sleep a lot, and Smashing Pumpkins would be on that playlist.
Could you work
while
while listening to Smashing Pumpkins?
No, I can't work with any music on at all. I actually listen sometimes to white noise in order to help me work.
Tell us what you're currently working on. What is engaging you now that the book is done? What's the next thing?
Yeah, what's interesting for you?
I'm doing some work. Well, this is overclaiming because my colleagues are doing some work that I think is incredibly interesting, and I'm sort of standing by observing. But let me answer it with this anyway, which is on, one of the big things that's happened since schools have closed is that EdTech, so platforms that allow you to do your schoolwork from anywhere, has just exploded. So all these EdTech providers in the UK, and I'm sure everywhere else, have gone, they've sort of got an 8-fold increase in the number of students using them, and the amount of time they're spending on it is radically increased. And so there's a really interesting opportunity to try and improve student persistence and attainment on those platforms, because there's a sort of, much larger new captive audience, and it's much more urgent that not only that they're using it, but that it's working particularly for the most disadvantaged kids who are likely to be, the last decade of closes, and the attainment gap's probably going to be wiped out by this lockdown if we don't do something about it. So there's some work that I'm, as I said, peripherally involved in on testing different behavioural interventions on EdTech platforms to try and figure out what works, and particularly what works for disadvantaged kids.
Just on that, what are you? Any initial findings? Are you coming up with anything at this point? I know it's probably too early, but anything that you can share?
So we don't have any results yet, but I think in terms of, is this a rich area to look at? The answer is definitely yes. So, and it's kind of an interesting intersection between basic UX and, just designing the user experience well, and then looking at things through a behavioural lens. So, there's little things on all of these platforms like particular features that you have to opt into and turn on in order to have access to, and there's looking at those and figuring out are the right ones opt in and are the right ones opt out is kind of interesting. We don't really have a ton of stuff yet, but it will be interesting when we can reveal it.
Do you think the implications might actually flow into future generations of the way educational technology gets deployed? Is kind of that your hope?
Yeah, and I think that we take this moment to imagine, to be really imaginative about what is a school and what could it look like. And it's really difficult to do that in a crisis. But our entire model of schooling is based on, some early 20th century model of what a classroom should be and all of those things. And of course, we've kind of come on and we've advanced. But for example, that analysis about how lockdown is likely to reverse attainment gains made over the last decade in terms of the gap between disadvantaged and advantaged students, that's what's happening every single summer when we send kids home for the summer and they don't have enough to eat and all of those sorts of things. And we know about that. The summer melt is a well-documented phenomenon and also studied in the behavioural literature. But, we could reconsider that and just think, what are we doing? Summer holidays are great if you're 8 years old and, you happen to have a great time in the summer, or if you're 15 years old or whatever, but they're kind of terrible for everybody else because, apart from teachers. So, are there sort of other ways that we could structure the school year and that we could, solve a lot of our problems all in one? And I'm sure tech will be a huge part of that, and having to figure out what is it about classroom delivery that you want to replicate via tech, and what is it that you want to disrupt and say the only reason we do one-to-many pedagogy in a classroom is because of practicalities. So why would we do that and continue that model over into a tech environment?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Actually, that's really exciting that the implications could be that far-reaching, because I'm really inspired by the idea of rethinking what school looks like. Like, why not? Like you said, we've got kind of a medieval version of this. Why not do something new? That's very cool.
You do a lot of work on application, right? So applying behavioral science into everyday work or policy, various different things. What are the key insights that you can bring on what we need to be thinking about as people who are behavioral scientists, but how do we apply that information in a meaningful way that actually makes a difference? Yeah,
I think the first thing is understanding the context that you're implementing things in really, really well, and how that differs from the context in which those insights may have originally been generated, which is very obvious. If you're talking about a heuristic that's been kind of identified and tested in a university research environment with 21-year-old undergraduate students or something, and then you're expecting that it's going to translate into children's social care and child protection, you're probably not going to have a particularly good hit rate with things that work. I think one thing that I find sort of frustrating but interesting is that you always want to kind of go for the fancy thing where you get to test the really clean mechanism, but you normally can't in an applied environment. So I think being a pragmatist and often recognizing that there might be 15 different things that you could try, but a lot of the time when you're doing applied behavioural science, actually some of the barriers will be really obvious things like there's loads of friction in this process. What if we just take it out? So, the thing that you want to test might not always be kind of aligned to the thing that actually just needs to be tested. Another thing which I think offsets some of the disappointment around not always getting to test the thing that you think would be most academically interesting is getting really excited about the experimental environment. So the fact that you can, you often have these enormous samples and you've got this chance to test something in a very kind of real world setting, and you get results quite quickly is pretty phenomenal. It's a real pleasure to be able to work on those things, and a big, responsibility when you're kind of actually testing things in the wild. And then the last thing is just nobody cares in policy about the sort of, the minutiae of exactly what you did. It won't sort of survive the next 6 months of telling the story of what happened as a result of it. So the more we can move away from talking about things in terms of p-values or standard deviations or whatever it might be, and translate it into things that policymakers care about. Like, a good example of this where, instead of talking about standard deviations, he'll talk about it's the equivalent of moving a kid from the worst school in Chicago to the best school in Chicago. That's much, much more compelling. And so, we should apply a bit of the behavioural science magic to ourselves and think about whether we're saying things in the way that's interesting and likely to kind of grab and sustain attention.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked with Rory Sutherland, and he was talking about applying, again, utilizing some experiments in the real world. And he's talking more business perspective. And he goes, business leaders could care less about if it's, treatment A, treatment B, what those specifics are. They're just looking at the bottom line and at the end result. And again, the story that you tell about that. And I think that correlates exactly with what you're saying here. It's, we have to understand who the audience is that we are trying to influence, and that audience, if it's academics, they're going to really care about the p-value and all of the modifiers and various different moderators that are going on in this place. Policymakers, business leaders they may have a passing interest in that, but I don't think that's going to be their key determinant of is this a good study or not, and a good application or not.
Yeah, I often think of it as what's the thing you need to put in the one pager and what's the thing you need to put in the person's other hand so they can feel it's weighty and credible. Like, that's the separation.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. You dream about a future where the behavioral lens is more evenly integrated into all these different disciplines: marketing, sales, HR, UX, CX, all those kinds of things. Will there still be a need, do you think, for specific behavioral science research to be done?
I mean, I have to say there'll still be a need, don't I? Because otherwise I'll be a pariah. But I do genuinely think there will still be a need, I think, in a number of ways. So I think one is you can only really mainstream stuff once it's tried and tested and proven, because if you are putting a bunch of things out there that people don't even need to think about applying and they're not robust, then you're going to end up with lots of rubbish interventions being designed because people aren't thinking about them. So, you would want some sort of way of the things that get internalized being the things that are sort of cardinal rules that work well. And so you want to be able to continue to generate new insights, to test the boundaries of existing ones. And I think, one of the other things we say we're particularly excited about in the future is the intersection of different methods and becoming more sophisticated on that front. So we've already got, there's research coming out that looks at how can you use data science and machine learning and those sorts of things in a way that gives you more precise insights into, what works for who, and how do you kind of stop effects fading over time, and how do you sort of target more effectively. There's also much, much better research coming out that bridges the gap between qualitative schools of evaluation and quant and all of those sorts of things, and brings sociology and its methods into the mix. I think that's really, really exciting. And so I think there's definitely always going to be a place where there's the kind of academic crucible where you're throwing in lots of new things and heating them up together and seeing what happens in a much more experimental and novel way before you kind of feed the end product into the mainstream.
Yeah, I think as humans, we're such complex social creatures, both neurologically as well as socially, that I think the well will not run dry on new insights anytime in any near future that I can foresee.
What would you say to your 16-year-old self to prepare you for where you're at today?
So I think I would say, I mean, if I was talking to my 16-year-old self, I'd just have to say it's going to pan out, and I don't really know why, but it's going to be all right, because my 16-year-old self was choosing what to do at university and picked to do English literature, and then went and did that, and then worked as a management consultant before getting into behavioural science. So that is not a path I would recommend to anyone, because I don't think it's likely that you would end up in behavioural science at all if you did that. But here I am. Nowadays, if I was talking to a 16-year-old, I would just say pick the things that make you curious and find a way to learn more about those. Because I think the advice that a lot of people receive is pick the thing that's going to get you the best career, or pick the thing that you're already good at in school, and those aren't sort of recipes for motivation. Of course, that's a very privileged position to be able to say pick the things that interest you and follow those, but given employability is pretty good out of lots of different degrees, there's not a lot in it, and if the deal breaker is whether you're interested in it or not, go with that.
I think that's fantastic advice, and I think we can probably wrap it up with that. Elspeth, thank you. This has been really given also. So for our listeners, we have had technical issues. We've had scheduling issues. So this has been a long time coming. We have been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. And so finally, thank you. It is finally here. And we are so glad that it happened.
I'm so happy we made it work. I'm so happy we made it work, and your listeners should just know how patient and lovely and kind the two of you are, because it's really been a mess getting here, and you've been nothing but wonderful about it.
Hey Groovers, welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our conversation with Elspeth, have a free-flowing discussion, and talk about whatever else comes into our ComB brains.
ComB.
Yes. Combiosis? What?
Hola.
Oh man. No, it's early in the morning, Tim. Have you already started drinking? I'm just worried. Yes. No, ComB. It was really interesting for me because I've heard of it. It's been in the lexicon of different models, but it hasn't been one that I have really used a lot. But we did this conversation with Elspeth about a month ago, and it's been much more prevalent in my thinking and how I'm looking at situations. And I attribute that to the great way that Elspeth talked about it.
Absolutely. So maybe we should start with a little bit of describing it. We're not experts in ComB, even as practitioners, but we should just talk a little bit about what the model is. And so the point of the model is to separate out the barriers to behavior change. So it's kind of helping to find the problem of getting the behavior change enacted more so than what the solution is, right?
It's like removing the friction points and understanding where those friction points out, and going back to a Roger Dooley kind of thing here. So
exactly. And so the letters COM-B stand for some specific things, right?
Right. So C, capability. All right. O, opportunity. M, motivation. And B stands for bullshit, right?
No, behavior.
Sorry. I thought you did the first three and then you ended up with all this BS, which was behavior. Sorry. Yeah. No. So getting into capability, right? The idea about this is, right, do you have the physical capability and do you have the psychological capability in order to do whatever that behavior is? And that's part of looking at this. Do you have that resource there, right?
Yeah, exactly. The O is about opportunity, right? Because there's physical and social opportunities that you need to take a look at. Again, if you're thinking about frictions, what are the things that are preventing those behaviors? Is there a barrier to physical opportunity or to social opportunity? Is it against some kind of social norm?
It's kind of the context, right? The context that you're going to be taking that behavior in when you think about that opportunity. Is it appropriate context for the behavior? And last is motivation, right? We have this automatic instinctual motivation and then a reflective motivation. There's intrinsic, extrinsic motivation that comes into this. There's all of these factors that influence. So all of those three influence whether or not a behavior actually happens. So if you want to, go out and exercise, that's the behavior, the desired behavior. Do you have the physical and the psychological, capability to do that, right? Do my legs work? Do I, if I want to go running, all of that physically, do I have enough energy? Do I have eaten all of those things that physically able to do it? Do I have the mental capacity to understand what I need to do there? The opportunity, am I stuck in quarantine, right? Can I not get outside to go run? Or can I? Can I get out there and physically do it? Are there some social barriers? Like if people see me running, they're gonna look at me and think I'm an idiot? Like the marathon joggers that used to started like in the 60s, they said that people looked at them really weird, right? And then do I have the motivation? What is the motivation for me to do that? And is that motivation going to be enough to spur me to get up out of bed on a day and put my running shoes on and go out there? So.
Right, especially from that automatic, that reflexive, versus reflexive part. Is it going to be like, oh, I spring out of bed because I've got my running shoes and my running clothes right there at the edge of the bed, ready to put on, or am I going to have to think about it? Is it not going to be so automatic, and I'm going to actually have to give it some consideration? So,
right, and it's just it's a nice way, particularly it's a simple way of looking. If you're in an organization, if you're a leader in an organization and you're trying to understand why your motive, you want people to do X, right? You want them to do this process or to go out and be more customer focused, right? And the specific behaviors you're looking to do. Well, this is a way of diagnosing. Right? You can look, are they capable of doing it? Do they have the training to go out and do that? Do they have the knowledge? Is there physical limitations on how that happens? Do they have the technology that's part of that physical element of capability in order to be able to do that? Then is there the opportunity? When does that opportunity express itself, and what's the context within that, and other the social norms that you have from an organization? What's the culture like within there that influence that? And then what's the motivation for them to do it? Right? What are they going to get out of this, and how did that happen? So it's a way of diagnosing some of this piece, and I thought it was really interesting, and that's how I've been looking at it in some of the work we've been doing with some of our customers. So
it also draws back to me how important problem diagnosis is, and how it's easy to jump to conclusions like, oh, we should just do this. Especially, man, in the corporate world, it's just about get shit done, make it happen fast. So the quickest way that we can get to sort of a simple, reasonable process or solution, then the better off we'll be. When really, COM-B says, let's actually step back and define the problem really well, because from a well-defined problem, we're going to have much better chances of developing a really on-target solution.
Yeah, and looking at the underlying root causes of the behavior, right? So, or restrictions from achieving that behavior. And that, again, just in everyday life, but also from a corporate perspective, if we can apply some of those models, and it's a nice, easy model to look at, on what are some of the other ones that the behavioral insight team came up with? It was EAST, which is easy, and we know that one. But then mind space, right?
Mindspace, yeah, fantastic. Both of them are great, but I love East. Easy, attractive, social, and timely. Man, that just goes into every presentation for me in my practice to talk with clients about this is how we're going to go about implementing it,
Yeah.
and everybody gets it. It's really a fantastic model that they developed. So
Yeah. And again, you use the model when it's appropriate. So these are different ways of looking at it.
yeah,
So what else, Tim? What else did we hear from Elspeth that we want to
well, there was
groove on and dig into?
Well, there was two interesting themes. One that I, as I listened to Elspeth's words, there's sort of a futuristic thing, and then there's some reflective stuff. And I wanted to talk about the things that she's thinking about for the future. We talked about what's next in government policy, and she really emphasized application. She
Okay.
really emphasized application, and I really deeply admire this about her as a committed scientist and researcher, that it's not just about good data or a published paper or a model, she's really very focused on the applications, and that bled into the conversation we had about education, because she's really passionate about education, right? And when she said, what does school look like going forward? And she doesn't have, this again is to me, the statement of a really good researcher is that she doesn't have the conclusions. She doesn't have the answers. She was just teeing up the questions like, man, we've been living in this centuries old model of education for some time. And what could we do to make the playing field better for those who have compared to those who have not? I thought like that's a really, really interesting question that she asked.
Well, and particularly in an age, right, where we're in COVID and schools, at least in Minneapolis, right, we are starting the school year in a distance learning piece, very different than how we started school last year. And it's an opportunity to re-examine some of those educational pieces, as she mentioned. And this is the part that just gets me, is we haven't changed the model, the model of a school for over 100 plus years, right? 1860s, 70s is when that school model, grades and moving up, and you get the summers off to go work on the farm and everything else. So
maybe there's new ways of looking. And by the way, that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't mean that there aren't good elements and solid reasons to be doing what we're doing. However, we're living in a different world. And it's not that the principles aren't important. It's the context that we're living in does give me cause to think that her question about the idea of what could we do to restructure a school year is really particularly relevant. And the last thing that she talked about in the future stuff was the future of behavioral science.
The year's 2121. What's that song? You would know the song. What's that?
Yeah. Gosh, I should know that off the top of my head. In the year 65.
Yeah, whatever it was. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
what's behavioral science going to be like in the future, Tim?
Well, we don't know, right? But we don't know because it's the future. But Elspeth came back with two observations that I thought were just really, really cool. And they reminded me of our recent conversation with Roy Baumeister in talking about the hedge fox. So this is just take a moment here. First, Elspeth said that the first thing she thought would be that mainstreaming of behavioral science would be good. Like that behavioral science as a field of study is important. And that kind of reminded me of the hedgehog, where we need to be able to have a field of study that's very singular and very focused, and to know a lot about that one thing, which is sort of like what the hedgehog does.
Right. But there's another aspect of this, which is really getting it mainstreaming so that behavioral science just becomes ubiquitous, right? So that it's integrated into the marketing teams, it's integrated into your UX teams, it's integrated into, the human resources departments within organizations. And so in that sense, it's almost like a fox, because it is just across the broad, genres of all of those. So I like it.
We're heading towards the hedge fox.
The hedge fox.
Yes. But
You'll have to listen to our interview with Roy Baumeister to really understand what a hedge fox is. So let's not let the cat out of the bag here, or the hedge fox out of the bag, Jim.
Oh, I love that. This idea of, wouldn't it be great to imagine a future where behavioral science is sort of invisible?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fabulous future. How about you, Kurt? What else?
Well, but the other part of that is she talked about, and I think this was another part that you're going to talk about, is this intersection of methods, right? This idea that behavioral science is going to get out of its own silo, and from a research perspective, not from an applications perspective so much, but probably that as well. But integration with AI, integrate with qualitative and quantitative work, integrating with sociology, with various different other programs and dynamics out there. And so really drawing on all of those pieces in order to inform this. And again, it goes back to the conversation we had with Tara Austin and De Bono's thinking, lateral thinking, right? We're getting these different perspectives that are coming in to play in, that are going to help inform our behavioral science work moving forward.
This is part of the magic of the foundational work in this field, was the mashup between behavioral psychology and economic decision making.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, you go back to that, and then just in recent years, integrating neuroscience into the behavioral world has been pretty fantastic. So there's a lot to go there.
So one of the things that I just loved about this conversation, and it got me thinking deeper, is just her going back and talking about the message to her 16-year-old self, and she mentioned something about how she goes, oh God, when looking back, I think how I was so stupid, or something along that line. And I think I might have misinterpreted it, but for me it resonated with this idea that, well, you don't even have to look back that long to think about your former self as not being nearly as intelligent or as full of wisdom as we are at this moment. Yeah. And and I use this example, we talked about this before, is this concept of, hey, I do a lot of work around communications. And when we started this work 20 years ago, I thought, man, and the communications is nice because you have this record. You can see, like, we built these workshops, these PowerPoints for these workshops, and these, promos and all this other stuff. And so we built these, and at the moment they were so cutting edge and so freaking cool. And then you look back, like even just 2 years, a year, and you look back and you go, ugh, that's crap. I mean, oh my God, look at the work we're doing now. This is so much better than this was. And then you go another 2 years and you look back at the stuff that 4 years ago, that was really crap. And then the stuff 2 years ago is just kind of crap. And the stuff we're doing now, but you have that record of looking at that. And I think we do that quite often with ourselves. We look at, the way we were thinking about something, our attitudes, our beliefs, all sorts of different things about who we are, the fears that we have. And we go, that was stupid. And yet, and I'm so much smarter and I know so much more today than I knew. And yet, 2 years down the road, we're going to be looking back at this time in our life, and we're going to be saying that same stuff about the way we're thinking and what we're doing right now.
Yeah. The way that our best thinking ends up becoming just litter on the road that we're leaving behind us can be a little sad, because it certainly reinforces the, what have you done for me lately? Or what new ideas do you have? On the other hand, it says that our world is changing pretty dramatically. And I see that as a good thing. And that the fact that we need to keep reinvesting in new ideas is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to be a total Debbie Downer, because I do think there are times when we can look back and we go, God, that was great. We did some really good stuff, or I was showing up at my best in that moment. And as a musician, this is my musical question to you, right? So when you look back at your older work, How does that compare for you to some of your newer work? And is there like one song or one album that you go, God, I was just hitting on all cylinders at this point, and this is the epitome? And I don't want to follow that up with just talking about, the one hit wonder bands, or, the bands that I love that had their first album was awesome, and then just it went down after that. So
yeah, it took me a long time to become a good songwriter. I wrote a lot of songs. I wrote hundreds of songs before I got to the point where I actually wrote some good songs. So it was a long trail of litter, but that litter was really crap. It was really good to let that go. But when I got to the point where I started writing better songs, the bar raised internally to write more. And so I became more critical of everything else that wasn't a good song that I was writing. So Anthems, which was my fifth record, is where I felt like I kind of struck a chord, no pun intended, but I struck the gong, or, I grabbed the brass ring from a songwriting perspective, at least for half the time. At least some of the songs are on that record. And on the subsequent record, on the last record, Another Orion, there's a couple of really good tunes on that record as well, but not all. And now I feel like the songs I'm writing now, they have to be at that level. If I'm not writing at that level, like, what's the damn point?
So Loss Aversion is not the epitome of your songwriting prowess, or there you go.
Well, and you ask about the one hit wonders. Part of it is that the freshman record is much easier to produce than the sophomore record, in part because typically when someone releases their first record, they've been saving up, writing a lot, and culling through all of their material to find the best tunes for their record. They have a lot of material to draw from, and they've zeroed in on absolute best. The second album is now it has to be new. It has to be fresh material. So they have a much smaller universe to work from. And so they have fewer ideas. There's just less in the hopper to choose from. And a lot of labels just drop people because they're like, well, you don't have enough good material, and oftentimes didn't give bands enough time and songwriters enough time to really continue to develop.
Well, but I'm thinking too, like Violent Femmes, right? First album, freaking amazing, right? You think about the like three relatively good alternative music hits from that, and songs that have stood the test of time.
Yeah.
And they have 4 or 5 subsequent records, and they've been around forever. And I think they're still trying to put music out. And the rest of the music, I think, is just crap. And maybe that's my personal opinion, but it's like they've degressed as from their musical and songwriting ability, right? And so
have they not? What is it that is less than inspiring about their subsequent albums? Does it sound too much the same, or is it too different?
Yeah, I think part of it is they don't have the catchy tunes. They don't have the pieces that all just kind of flow together. And I think there are some times where you catch magic, right? You catch magic in a bottle, and everything, just the inspiration was there for you. The music showed up or whatever. And I'm not a musician, so I'm just grasping at straws here, but this concept of
the context that they were released in.
Yeah.
Or when you heard it for the first time,
which is probably another big piece of it. It has to fit within the context. It's like you look at the Rolling Stones and you look at any of the albums they've released in the last, 10, 15, 20 years. And I don't know. Could you name any of the songs from any of those?
Not right off the top of my head, no.
Yeah, but you could name, songs from the 60s and 70s.
Absolutely.
And again, you go, those guys had everything in their favor to continue to create really great music. And maybe it is. And maybe it's just that we're not hearing it. And maybe it's just because the business of music has moved on. But there are some of those artists who seem to stay up. U2 to a certain degree did a little bit better, I think, than others in trying to change up their sound and stay with the times and still be a little bit true to who they are. And they did a decent job of that. But I don't know.
We've talked about artists who have had top 10 hits in every decade that they've been producing music. James Taylor being one of them, Paul Simon being another, David Bowie was one that had a hit in every decade. That was alive. Michael Jackson, as well. Although with some with the Jackson 5, some as a solo artist, and part of it is that they had the bandwidth and the support of the label and their fans to continue to explore and do things. I look back at U2 and go, Achtung Baby, just, that just never worked for me. But
no.
Poetry in the same decade was a magnificent record.
But you look at too those people that did that, and granted, James Taylor maybe not so much, but they changed. Right? I mean, you look at David Bowie and you look at his stuff from the 70s versus the stuff from the 80s versus his stuff that he did in the 90s. Yeah. And there's a distinct difference. And
evolved production methods quite a bit. Well, James Taylor did too. I would
okay. I'm not that familiar with James, but it's interesting though. But they had to shift and change with the times. And I wonder, it'd be very interesting to sit there and to have a conversation with James Taylor and go, James, is your new stuff, how do you feel about that compared to your stuff from 1970s? It'd be just
on my list for the next time I chat with him.
There you go. All right. So with that, listeners, please, thanks for indulging us in our musical diatribes here, but hang on for the bonus track. Hey Groovers, this is Kurt with the bonus track for our episode with Elspeth Kirkman. Once we got past the scheduling and technical challenges to record our session with Elspeth, she was generous and thoughtful and offered some terrific wisdom that we were very happy to share. In that very short conversation, we covered a lot of ground, but we want to focus on these 3 things. First, we discussed how important models can be in helping us solve problems, and we focused in on how COM-B model is getting good use at BIT. COM-B focuses on 3 aspects of behavior change, and they are capability, opportunity, and motivation. There are links in the notes, and we recommend you check it out for your behavior change initiatives. Second, we talked about the keys to good application. Here, Elspeth was very focused on making applications relevant to real-world problems. She used words like context and pragmatism and actual impact, and it's always a good process to hear and to think about researchers who use those words. Clearly, Elspeth is happy to move beyond p-values and standard deviations, and as practitioners, we were very, very happy to hear that. Lastly, we discussed the future of behavior science, and Elspeth laid out a couple of important themes here. On one hand, we need to keep studying behavioral science so we can integrate the findings into the mainstream of business and government policy. And on the other hand, she imagines a future with more crossover of behavioral science with fields like AI and how quantitative and qualitative tools might work better together. All of those things are exciting to think about. Okay, here's our groove idea for the week. We've got some links in the notes on how to learn more about COM-B, and we'd like you to give it a try this week. Pick out one thing you'd like to improve in your work life. We do not recommend using behavior change models on your family. Just a note there. They may not like it. So pick up something that you'd like to improve in your work and see how you might be able to get a clear picture of your problem by analyzing it through a COM-B model. Capability. Do you have the physical and psychological capability? Opportunity. Is the context right for this? And motivation. What's the motivation that you have for this? You might be able to understand the problem better, and because of that, create a better solution. And please let us know what you come up with. We're excited to hear about your observations and ideas. And finally, as we continue to work through life in a pandemic, we hope you go out and have a good week.